From Bowling Green State University and the Institute for the Study of Culture and Society, this is BG Ideas.
I'm going to show you this with a wonderful experiment.
You're listening to the Big Ideas podcast, a collaboration between the Institute for the Study of Culture and Society and the School of Media and Communication at Bowling Green State University. I'm Jolie Sheffer, Professor of English and American Culture Studies and the Director of ICS. As always, the opinions expressed on this podcast are those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of BGSU or its employees. Bowling Green State University and its campuses are situated in the Great Black Swamp and the Lower Great Lakes region. This land is the homeland of the Wyandot, Kickapoo, Miami, Potawatomi, Odawa, and multiple other indigenous tribal nations present and past who were forcibly removed to and from the area. We recognize these historical and contemporary ties in our efforts toward decolonizing history, and we thank the indigenous individuals and communities who've been working and living on this land from time immemorial. On this episode, we look at disability justice and accessibility in higher education. My guest is Dr. Rosemarie Garland-Thomson, a professor emerita of English and bioethics at Emory University and senior advisor at the Hastings Center, the world's premier bioethics research institute. Her scholarly work helped develop the fields of critical disability studies and health humanities. Rosemarie visited BGSU in January 2023 through Phi Beta Kappa's Visiting Scholar Program. Thanks for joining me today, Rosemarie.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be with you.
Over the past several years, there have been more and more conversations in higher ed and the tech industry around the importance of understanding disability and providing equitable access. However, we've also seen that these words can be mere buzzwords that don't necessarily get followed into action. Can you talk about how you define disability and how you'd like our audience to understand the term?
Disability is an identity category now worldwide, but certainly in the United States. And it has emerged from being a medical condition to being a political identity and a social identity as a result of the civil and human rights initiatives and the laws and the practices that started in the mid-20th century in the United States, but also worldwide. And so disability has transformed from what it used to be to what it is now, and it has joined the ranks, if you will, of identity categories in the initiatives that we now call diversity, equity, and inclusion. And in my view, it's a great place to be.
Almost everyone at some point of their life will become disabled, whether through illness, injury, or simply aging. But I think still disability is rarely framed as an inevitability. What are some of the factors that you see influencing the sociocultural responses to disability? And are there ways that we might better reframe the conversation for the general public to embrace the term?
The word disability itself is a rather controversial word, and so it's important to understand the history of the word and how we use it today. So, as I suggested, disability in a pre-civil and human rights era was understood strictly as a medical category, as a form of deviance. So in higher education, disability was understood as a part of medical anthropology or sometimes sociology under the category of deviance studies, and also, of course, was studied a great deal in medical science and healthcare. What's new about disability studies today and the way disability studies is inflected by what I was calling the diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives is that disability is understood as part of, if you will, the suite of diversity categories that have been brought forward not just in education, but in culture in general. And so it's important to understand that knowing about disability is to know about disability in a variety of different ways and through a variety of different, and this is what matters in higher education, through a variety of different knowledge enterprises, which is what we sometimes call disciplines. So, as I mentioned, we've been thinking about disability a lot in sociology and in medical anthropology, and certainly in medical science over a long while. But only recently, within the last 20 years or so, have we thought about disability in terms of the humanities, and in terms specifically of what I call the narrative humanities, and that is to say, the subjects such as history or literary studies or film studies, art history, music, these humanities enterprises that think about the meaning-making functions of representation, whether it's visual representation, narrative representation, musical representation. And this is a flowering of knowledge in general. And the flowering of knowledge about disability has been particularly productive, I think, in higher education, in and through these kinds of disciplines, these kinds of knowledge enterprises that think about culture and arts and society and ethics and how these considerations weave together.
It strikes me in hearing you talk that part of that process is about bringing back together these disciplines that over time sort of calcify into separate conversations. Thinking about the medical and the narrative, it's not as though there haven't been narratives all along, and yet we're again being reminded of the importance of putting the humanities in dialogue with the sciences, with technology, with other things. But part of what you're also talking about with the flourishing of a kind of civil rights discourse is insisting on that movement away from seeing disability as an object of study to the subjects who have something to say. And the title of one of your more recent books reflects on that with the adage of nothing about us without us. Could you talk a little bit about that as a kind of mantra or aphorism to guide kind of the current conversations around disability?
I think we need to go back to the history of knowledge in higher education, to the mid-20th century civil rights movement and human rights movement, and how it really transformed institutions. So in the United States, we have, in the mid-1960s, things like the Civil Rights Act of 1968, which begins as legislation that says basically it's against the law to discriminate against someone based on nationality or religion or ethnicity. And gender isn't even mentioned early on, and certainly disability is not mentioned, or sexuality early on in this legislation. But what happens is that there is more and more and more pressure to increase what we think of as diversity categories and identity categories, as different groups are recognized, and the exclusions and inclusions and the challenges to making this occur, to desegregate the public sphere and to integrate the public sphere, to use that kind of language, moves forward through the second half of the 20th century and into the 21st century everywhere. So there's a coordination of the laws and an expansion of the laws, an amendment of the laws to move forward into what we might think of more, as I said, I like these terms, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and to institutionalize those practices and policies throughout the whole society. So there's an interplay between legislation and practice and ethics and politics in some way. And for higher education and in general, in terms of public policy, it is the women's movement which really begins this, although it's hard to say exactly which movement begins first. But let's start with the concept of the women's movement worldwide, but certainly in the United States in the mid-20th century. And this movement comes from what we think of now as grassroots organizations. It is in tandem with the civil rights movement, the Black civil rights movement, particularly in the United States, and other attendant ethnic movements. All of these movements took place largely through things like marches and sit-ins and different kinds of activist protests that was so much a part of the mid-20th century. And what that did is that it changed the character of institutions. So it changed the character of, let's say, higher education by simply bringing people into higher education that had been excluded. So, for example, the more elite any institution of higher education was in the mid-20th century, the more exclusive it was, the more people who were excluded from it. So big state universities always had gender, racial, ethnic integration, but institutions like Harvard and Yale, the more elite places, the military academies, West Point, for example, the Naval Academy, they did not have women. They had people, what we think of now as people of color, people of different ethnic groups, but not women. So gender integration came in the mid-20th century, and it literally came in about 1973. Suddenly, the U.S. government said to schools, you will admit women. You will treat women equally. You will treat ethnic and racial minorities equally. They did not say at that time, you will treat people with disabilities equally. That came a bit later. So the first law that affected higher education was the Architectural Barriers Act of 1968, where the federal government said if you're going to get money from the federal government, and of course schools all get money from the federal government, you will make your institution accessible to people with disabilities. Well, nobody knew what that meant at that time, so people got a bunch of ugly metal ramps and they strapped them onto the fronts of buildings, and they started thinking about how can we do this? And the architects and the designers and the educators started thinking about how can we really get people with disabilities into these places? What do we have to do that? What needs to be built and redesigned in terms of knowledge, but also in terms of the designed and built environment? So it took a long time for that to happen. At the same time, what was happening is that other groups who had historically been excluded, women, people of ethnic and racial minority groups, what we used to call LGBTQ people, were also generally excluded. And so we started thinking about how those people could be admitted and how those people could function. And so when those people started to come into the institutions, we began to understand how an increased understanding of diversity could occur. And so there was a way of one group kind of bringing in other groups and making the way to bring in other groups. And so we had the transformation that feminist theory and women's studies brought to knowledge and practice. And then with that, the transformations that ethnic studies and critical race theory brought with it, and LGBTQ and queer theory, and disability studies came along with that a little bit later, so that we have a kind of integrated movement now of these various movements and knowledge enterprises that interact with and entwine with one another. I think the term interdisciplinarity, which has got kind of tarnished a bit in the oppositional press these days, but it's really a productive way of thinking about things because, of course, every human being has a social position in every single one of these social systems. So we all belong somewhere in the gender system. We all belong somewhere in the race and ethnicity system. We all have a position somewhere in the ability-disability system. And to think about how these multiple identities all operate for any one person or any group of people is extremely productive in thinking about expanding our notion of how justice and equality and inclusion might work.
Your work, has taken you. You began as a literary scholar, and now you're doing bioethics work. And in your role as a bioethicist, you've advocated for critical disability studies to be applied as a knowledge base in medical science. So you are working at the intersections of all of these different disciplines. How do you think that interdisciplinary approach, the sort of bringing together, how that works in critical disability studies, how does it help make for better medical practice as well as lived experience in this world?
One way I think to think about this is that there are two kinds of knowledge that operate where we are now and when we are now. And one of those forms of knowledge might be called, I like to call it counting and measuring knowledge. And that kind of knowledge is privileged in our world now. And it's the kind of knowledge that medical science uses and technology uses, what we sometimes call STEM knowledge, if you will, which is sometimes called quantitative knowledge. Another kind of knowledge, which I like to call narrative knowledge or storied knowledge, is the knowledge of the humanities, and it is the knowledge of the human experience. And that kind of knowledge is very important for human beings to have and to recognize in terms of who we are and how we live our lives and how we live with one another and how we make lives. And that kind of knowledge comes to us most fully in the humanities. And so an enterprise that we call interdisciplinary, that brings together counting and measuring knowledge and narrative knowledge or lived knowledge, to bring those together is very important in terms of an ethics of anything, an ethics of knowledge, but also an ethics of living, an ethics of governing, an ethics of community building, an ethics of public policy. And so it's particularly important in thinking about medicalization and science and the medicalization of the human body and the development of medical technologies and equipment and what we think of most broadly as healthcare, to bring this kind of lived knowledge, this humanities knowledge, if you will, this narrative knowledge into policy and practice in relation to disability in particular. And so that's why an interdisciplinary approach, if you will, to disability and building knowledge and making policy and practice about disability is so important.
We're going to take a quick break. Thanks for listening to the Big Ideas Podcast.
Question. Answer. Discussion.
If you are passionate about big ideas, consider sponsoring this program. To have your name or organization mentioned here, please contact us at ics@bgsu.edu.
Welcome back to the Big Ideas Podcast. Today, I'm talking with Dr. Rosemarie Garland-Thomson about accessibility and disability justice. Colleges and universities are viewed as conservative institutions that reproduce systems of what scholar Robert McRuer termed compulsory able-bodiedness. What do you see as the challenges of working within a structure that was not originally built for wide inclusion and accessibility? And are there opportunities as well?
There are absolutely opportunities, and higher education, universities, and colleges are conservative institutions simply because they already exist, because they are already literally built, and because they are, like every institution, based on an aggregation of what has been done in the past. At the same time, higher education is based on the past, but it's devoted to the future. And it is a very important and very generative place for new knowledge to be produced and to be disseminated. And although one of the most significant and I think tired cliches about higher education is that it is an ivory tower, in fact, it is not, because what it does is that it looks toward the future by providing people that go there with a sense of what a usable past has been and then how to make something out of that usable past when students go out into the world to make a life and to find meaningful work and to shape the institutions and the communities into which they enter. So in that sense, higher education is extremely progressive. And disability studies, along with a good number of the other so-called identity studies, that's a kind of forbidding word, but the knowledge enterprises, which is a pretentious word, I love to be pretentious, to allow students to discuss with one another, to engage with the past and the knowledge base of the past, and to think about how they might transform the worlds that they're moving into with this new kind of knowledge that carries with it an obligation, an ethical obligation, and a political commitment to what we think of as diversity, equity, and inclusion, or, frankly, democracy and progress, if you will, to think about that and to encourage students to think about how identities and equity might operate in their worlds in the very broadest sense. In other words, to think about that which is generative along with what we think of as critique, I think is very positive. And the idea of an interdisciplinary ethical enterprise, such as disability studies or LGBTQ studies or African American studies, ethnic studies, women and gender studies, these are very exciting and forward-looking enterprises.
An ongoing conversation in the disability rights movement is about how to move beyond providing accommodations for access in an inaccessible world and turning towards disability justice. How do you understand the term disability justice? And do you think it adds kind of new dimensions to our discussion of what does it mean to create a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive higher education environment?
There certainly is an important relationship between the apparatuses of integration, things like getting accommodations, these various forms of integration practices or desegregation practices that have the effect of increasing the diversity of who we are literally with when we enter into the public world. And this is why I like to use the term integration and desegregation. If we end up working with someone with a disability, suppose you are someone who is not a wheelchair user, and you go out into the world and you ride the subway or a bus. If you end up sitting next to someone on the subway or a bus who's a wheelchair user, or someone with a white cane, or someone using sign language, you then have a relationship with that person without the apparatuses of accommodations, of disability rights law. These people would never be together. Non-disabled people and disabled people would not be in the same spaces if it were not for these laws. And so what this creates is justice through the apparatuses of laws that are intended to desegregate and to integrate the public spaces that we all share together. And so that's why it's important that, as I said, all of these apparatuses of desegregation, of what we think of as equity, contribute to creating a just and equitable environment. And that's why the business of justice is often things like community building, providing accommodations, the legal and policy apparatuses that end up creating the communities that we all want to and need to share together.
How do you see the relationship between disability justice and racial justice?
They are not even so separate as to be entwined, but rather they are one complete project. And I think it's important to think about critical theory in this respect. And what critical theory does is that when it comes from the social sciences, in particular sociology, it tells us that social systems arise as interpretive systems that make meaning out of human variations and human differences. And these social systems we think of as race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, and disability, and that these are really descriptive paradigms for the way societies organize and understand human differences. And there's a long, deep history, if you will, it's the history of tribalism and the history of biology, if you will. And that history would have said that people that lived in villages and small communities were, for the most part, quite alike, except, of course, for what we think of as sexual difference or gender difference, because there have always been human beings that the gender system or the sex system categorized as men and women, turned them into a binary based on human characteristics, and then other systems have developed that we think of as race and ethnicity systems or the ability and disability system. So to have a sociological approach, I think, is really interesting and important. But we need to understand that these are just taxonomies, that these are interpretive systems, and that fundamentally human differences and human communities operate so that all of these variations operate together and create different kinds of human relationships and human networks of identity and relatedness. And so we need to recognize that these systems are interpretive templates. They are not essences. And that's one of the things that social theory helps us understand a lot better. And if we put social theory along with political theory, along with systems of representation, we can get a much fuller understanding of how human beings have lived together and how they do live together and how we should live together.
As we wrap up today's conversation, what advice would you give to our listeners who are interested in disability justice and want to find ways to advocate for themselves, for friends, family, and the broader communities they inhabit?
Always be generous and always be generative. There are benefits, but there are also limits to critique. And critique is a first step. Generosity and generativity, what my former colleague and friend Eve Sedgwick called reparative narratives, I think are what we should strive for finding, for creating, and for sharing with one another.
Listeners can keep up with ICS happenings by following us on Twitter and Instagram at ICS-BGSU and on our Facebook page. You can listen to Big Ideas wherever you find your favorite podcasts. Please subscribe and rate us on your preferred platform. For more information or to suggest an episode topic, visit us at bgsu.edu/BG Ideas. This episode was sound engineered by Ian Besselman, Alexis Miller, Brendan Akatura, and Marco Mendoza. Research assistance and script writing for this episode were provided by Carrie Hanlon.